Thank you, Ross Mitchell. Well, I wish I could understand what Sir Mick. Mick is a knight. But I can't understand what he's saying when he's saying like that. Well, anyway, it's later than you think. All right, it's later than you may think. Don't forget to set your clock ahead of 1 hour effective right now. Or come tomorrow, you're going to be late. You're going to be late, as Mick might say. All right, we're talking with John Scura tonight, author of Battle Hymn. This is a book. I'm not just saying this. It's a book I highly recommend. It's very, very easily readable. Is that even an intelligent? No, not really. It's easy to read, and it breaks this stuff down to where it's easy to understand. They're not big monstrous chapters. It's a thick, well-written book with a lot of information in it. You will enjoy it. Battle Hymn. And we will return and continue our most singular discussion with John Scura when we return. Let us get this little break out of the way. Go make yourself another cup of tea. Make yourself comfortable. And Coast to Coast AM will be right back. John Scura, author of Battle Hymn. You know, somebody just sent an email that we'll just take another little side trip and then get back on the track that we were on. But she writes, I'm one of those people that have been taught don't bring up politics or religion because it causes adverse discourse. And now the danger that is lurking because people haven't been discussing these things realistically with each other may be our downfall. You know, there's a story, an old kiddie story from Dr. Seuss, who Craig Ferguson calls Dr. Seuss, which is actually the correct pronunciation of the name, but it'll be Dr. Seuss. I don't remember the name of the story, but I remember there was this turtle wanted to be the king. And so he made all the other turtles stack up on each other's back so he could be way up high there. And his downfall was the one on the bottom who burped. And his burp shook the throne of the king, and he came tumbling down. Now he's king of the mud, for that's all he can see. So, John, do you have any idea that, all right, let me put it another way. What can the citizenry do to thwart this initiative by these very highly organized, very connected, very well-funded organizations?
Well, my first target would be the Federal Reserve System, with which Americans were saddled in 1913 and has been a blight on this country ever since. I could give you a bit of history of it, if
Please.
you like.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the central banks, first of all, central banks are nothing new in America. That, when we were a British colony, we used to print our own money. It's called colonial scrip. And it was printed according to the demands of trade and industry, and it was done without charging any interest. This changed with the Currency Act of 1764, which was forced upon the colonials by British Parliament at the urging of the Bank of England. Suddenly, colonists had to accept British currency and pay interest on it, and this caused an economic depression and unemployment. And Benjamin Franklin maintained that this was the principal cause of the Revolution. Okay, so we win the Revolution, we kick England out of here. Who comes along but Alexander Hamilton? He wants to create a central bank overseen by wealthy elite class. His opponents accused Hamilton of being an agent of international bankers. Thomas Jefferson was among the accusers. But he succeeded, and the Bank of North America was created in 1781. It practiced what is called fractional reserve banking, which simply is lending money it does not possess at interest. In other words, banking typically is a scam, and when you do it on a national level, you get to make an awful lot of money. The new bank was tasked with printing America's currency, which immediately plummeted in value. 4 years later, Congress refused to renew the Bank of North America, and due to ruinous inflation and fraudulent practices. Hamilton didn't give up. He went at it again and established another central bank in 1791, First Bank of the United States. About 80% of its capital came from private investors, among them foreign bankers like the Rothschilds. The new bank soon became the path of its, it just soon followed the same path of its predecessor, created inflation in which prices rose 72% in 5 years. After 20 years of causing a ruin in America, the bank came up for renewal in 1811, and the charter was defeated, obviously, in Congress. Nathan Rothschild, who was running wasn't running the Bank of England yet, but he was well established in England. He made a threat. He said either the application of the charter is granted or the United States will find itself involved in a most disastrous war. Well, the War of 1812 took place, and it did spell disaster for this nation. It drained its treasury and destroyed the national credit standing, and we simply had to renew a central bank charter because of it. This occurred in 1816, and the government issued a new 20-year charter to the Second Bank of the United States. The new charter was identical to the previous one, meaning 80% of the prime stockholders were private investors, many of them foreign. Now, along comes Andrew Jackson in 1828. He wins the election. He makes no secret of his opposition to any American central bank, but the current charter is not going to expire until 1836, which would be at the end of a second term if Jackson were reelected. So in the meantime, what Jackson did was eliminate the bankers' representatives from government service. He fired 2,000 of them out of a total of 11,000 federal government employees. He won re-election in a landslide in 1832, and then he's right away went to work again. He removed government deposits from the Second Bank and placed them in state banks. Second Bank president named Nicholas Biddle, who was an agent of Jacob Rothschild in Paris, according to author Eustace Mullins, immediately threatened to create a depression by making money scarce if the charter was not renewed. Biddle called in loans while refusing to extend new ones, and it caused the financial panic and the depression that he promised. Biddle blamed Jackson for the disaster, and the press bought it. So Congress convened and actually, it was called what historians call the panic session, actually censured Jackson. First time an American president was ever censured by Congress. But Biddle's boasts finally got to him and turned Congress against him. And the Second Bank Charter finally was not renewed. A year later, Jackson survives an assassination attempt by a mentally ill painter named Richard Lawrence. When both of Lawrence's new pistols misfired at point-blank range, I mean, talk about, divine intervention. Lawrence was subdued by a group of bystanders. One of them was Congressman Davy Crockett. In his trial, Lawrence received a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity, despite the attempts of prosecutor Francis Scott Key, the writer of our national anthem, to stress that Lawrence had lived in England and had boasted that he was, quote, in touch with the powers in Europe. Anyway, Jackson finished his second term, and at the end of the second term, the national debt was entirely paid, and the government was running on surplus that allowed the next president, Martin Van Buren, to distribute funds to the states. I mean, everything was wonderful. So you could see the advantage of not having a central bank. This arrangement in which the U.S. Treasury Department printed American currency without charging interest continued into the next century, despite repeated attempts by European bankers to create economic chaos. These attempts are known today as bank panics of 1873, 1893, and 1907, all of them deliberately created by international bankers who retracted loans and refused to grant new ones. That's what they do every time. That will cause chaos. The Panic of 1907 was clearly instigated by J.P. Morgan as an agent of the Rothschilds. It destroyed a number of American banks and seemed to some a lesson that the U.S. needs a central bank. Okay, so we have now a move toward that, which I have to say, and this was not my word, a conspiracy. It was admitted by the people who were involved at this secret meeting in 1910, called by Senate Republican leader Nelson Aldrich. All of these wealthy bankers met together at a posh resort in 1910 on Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia. Aldrich had spent the previous 2 years studying Germany's central bank system, and one of the shining lights of that system, Paul Warburg, a German banker, ran the meetings. These meetings were so secretive that only first names were used, and new servants were hired at the resort who did not know the participants. The banking families hatched a plan to ram a central banking act through Congress, which in 1913 would become the Federal Reserve System. A huge propaganda campaign was launched through bribed newspaper editors and publishers, and through academics, one of them being a certain professor at Princeton named Woodrow Wilson. Now, Wilson finally gained the White House in 1912 election. He was the bankers' candidate. They knew he was going to okay and get the Federal Reserve passed through. He was running against the incumbent, though, William Howard Taft, who was opposed to the banking bill. And Wilson's chances were pretty poor until the bankers decided to convince Teddy Roosevelt to run for the presidency in a new progressive party funded by Morgan executives. Roosevelt stole votes from Taft, and Wilson won. So here we have Wilson in the White House now, and despite fierce resistance from congressmen like Charles Lindbergh Sr., Louis McFadden, Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act in 1913. There is some question about the ratification of this act, as congressional vote was held just 2 days before Christmas of that year, when many of the lawmakers were not present. One rumor claimed that there were just 3 senators present for this vote, which is not a quorum, obviously. We called the Library of Congress trying to find out, a record of the yeas and nays on this vote, and we were astonished to learn that the record of this vote was missing.
Missing?
It was missing, yes. Later on, another of the persons in the Library of Congress said, "Oh no, we found it now, and here's the big tally of the vote." I just thought it was very suspicious that it was missing at first, and all of a sudden turns up. Anyway, following its passage, Lindbergh Sr. Glumly predicted, quote, "From now on, depressions will be scientifically created. The invisible government by the monetary power will be legalized." Now, near the end of his last term, Wilson admitted, too late, "I have unwittingly ruined my country. We are no longer a government by free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and the vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men." So now we have the Federal Reserve System intact. What is it? Well, first of all, it's not a part of the federal government. It's amazing how many Americans do not know that.
Are there stockholders in this bank, John? I mean, if it's a private bank, who owns the stock in the thing?
It is a privately held corporation consisting of 12 Federal Reserve banks serving different parts of our country. The Federal Reserve Board of Governors is an independent agency that receives no congressional funding, so therefore they're not answerable to Congress. They have 7 members whose terms of service often are longer than those of our presidents. Now,
let me agonize over this for a second. These people control the monetary policy of this country, but they're not accountable to anybody?
Not to anybody. In fact, we don't even get to know who they are. The owners of the Federal Reserve are anonymous. Their identities are hidden even from Congress and the President himself due to provisions of the Federal Reserve Act, which stipulate that Class A stockholders shall never be revealed.
Well, how can we find out who they are?
There are journalists who have looked into it and say, first of all, that they've learned that the Rothschilds own 53% of the stock, okay?
Oh, is that all? Only 53?
Yeah, but I mean other people like the Schiffs and Warburg family and stuff like that own other pieces of the stock. So obviously a very large portion, the majority of the stock is owned by foreigners, all right? They're not Americans.
This makes me mad, John.
Oh, it's believe me, the Federal Reserve System has been a curse to this country. I can go on. I mean, this is really basically the heart of the book, I think. This privately owned, foreign-dominated institution prints all U.S. currency and charges interest for it. And the ability of Federal Reserve to print money that has no real backing, by the way, has led to a constant state of inflation that has caused our dollar to shrink to about 4 cents compared to its value in 1933. So this isn't accidental. I mean, these, they manipulate the economy. They cause depressions. They cause inflations.
And they make money every time they do it.
Yeah, because the purpose really is redistribution of money from our pockets into their pockets, and from let's see there's 280 million Americans, so a little bit from everybody is a lot of money.
John, I got a question that's been dogging me for years because, as you know, you can hear absolutely anything out there. But there have been rumors circulating, and again, this may be just some effluvia in the wind, if you will. But is there any truth to these rumors that have circulated off and on, just touch and go here and there, that Adolf Hitler, Abraham Lincoln, and John Kennedy all wanted to get rid of central banks, and for that reason they were completely taken out?
Well, yeah, actually, I don't know about Hitler. I know Napoleon Bonaparte was an enemy of central banks, but when he came back from Elba, he had no money. He had to go back to the Rothschilds to borrow money. But yeah, Kennedy and Lincoln especially. It's interesting because Lincoln, of course, came up with greenback dollars to help fund the Civil War, and Kennedy came up with a presidential directive to create money based on silver, and he brought in $4.3 billion worth of new notes based on this. These notes were created and put into the American currency by the Treasury Department, as did Lincoln. So there was no interest charged. Now, okay, we have Kennedy and Lincoln. Both of them were murdered in office in public.
Yes.
I consider the public murder very important because I think it's sending a message.
Oh, it certainly does. And, it's interesting to me that in the case of the head Nazis over there, do you think that I think we know that many names that we would recognize did business with Germany all through those years. Do you think that they were all executed and done away with like that so that nobody would talk?
No, I really don't. I mean,
because they just executed them one after another. They just got rid of all of them.
Well, are you talking about Hitler executing bankers?
No, I'm talking about all of the Germans in the hierarchy were done away with. Goebbels out of there, Himmler out of there, Adolf out of there, Bormann disappeared. He went to South America. Paul Manning wrote a book called Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile, and named several corporations that are still in business today that were among the 640 some odd corporations that were created in the last 6 months of the war.
Yeah, but I mean, the people who were running IG Farben, who, had built Auschwitz and were using slave labor in all those camps, those guys got away scot-free. Now, they at worst got a slap on the hand.
Well, so did Thyssen and Krupp.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's the United States.
Now, we're just a couple of guys talking here, so just, don't go anywhere you don't want to go. But I have a propensity for really indiscreet questions as well as answers. So just roll however you want to.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say that, an awful lot of the Nazis got out of Germany, as you know, at the end of the war, and they were valuable to the United States. And I'm not talking about just the rocket scientists. I'm talking about everything, spies, people who were like Galen, who was in charge of intelligence on the Eastern Front. They were going to use him against the Russians because, he's already got, all the info. Anybody who could be useful to the United States, including people who were involved in biological weapons research, chemical weapons research, they were all given a sweetheart deal to come here in the United States and earn good salaries working for us.
Well, and apparently whoever drafted the 37, I think it was the 1937 Gun Control Act in Germany, they lifted some of that language directly out of that and made the 68 Gun Control Act, which was really kind of lame, but that's where it came from. Yeah.
Actually, there's been a Gun Control Act lurking since 1961. It was done under Kennedy's administration. So, those things are there. The legislation is written, but nobody has, because they're so unpopular, nobody has had the nerve to try to enforce them.
Understood and appreciated. We are speaking tonight with John Scura, the author of Battle Hymn, Revelations of the Sinister Plan for a New World Order. But there are not only problems, there are solutions. Why? Because the longer you listen, the less divided we are. Never mind the attitude. Never mind the perception. Let's just deal with the truth and let's sort this bloody thing out, because when it comes right down to it, this is our country, and this is Coast to Coast AM. I miss him. I really do. But he lives on, and isn't it amazing how we thought the music was prophetic back in the day? It's even more prophetic now. And I want to ask our guest, John Scura, author of Battle Hymn, when we come back, if any of the current presidential candidates are part of the Bilderbergers, and just see what he has to say about that. And we will soon morph into other things, such as the secret Masonic agenda and several other things that you may find interesting, including Bohemian Grove, where hooded people dance around and do mock sacrifices and all kinds of weirdness. It's, you know, what's really interesting to me? What's interesting to me is that so many of these ones who criticize religion, criticize Christianity specifically, isn't it interesting that they're all up in that satanic thing? I didn't know you could have one without the other. We will explore this. Get yourself another proper cup of tea. Strap in, because we're still flying inverted, in case you didn't notice. And don't forget to set your clock ahead 1 hour. And don't forget to join Coast Insider. You will find it a very valuable resource as the radio landscape shifts. We will shift with it, and we will return with John Scura, author of Battle Hymn. 2 minutes. Stand by. This is Coast to Coast AM. John Scura, let me ask you something. This information is so rich, and it is so sensitive. How far out on the clothesline are you and your partner Dane Phillips as far as being sent any messages being sent your way to stop what you're doing?
Well, so far nothing. I wasn't
good.
expecting anything. I mean, you know, we're small fries compared to those guys. I don't think that we pose much of a threat.
Okay.
Well, hopefully it'll stay that way. But yeah, I wasn't really expecting anything like that.
All right, good. Well, it seems like I heard a rumor that Dane had a car problem or something that looked suspicious once upon a time.
He blew out a tire. You know, it would be fun to believe that somebody tried to assassinate him, but sometimes a blowout is just a blowout. He was going 85 at the time, so...
Oh, well, yeah, I've had him blow out before, and I didn't see any Men in Black.
So, I need more proof than a blowout.
Okay.
You know, like if a mechanic looked under there and saw, you know, what was left of a bomb or something. Okay.
Okay. All right. Well, do we dare ask, are any Bilderbergers in the presidential candidacy lineup?
Well, you know, I wrote this and researched it in 2010, which was well before anybody knew who was going to be a candidate on the Republican side. I know Obama is not, but as I said, he's populated his administration with CFR and Bilderberg and trilateral members. If I had to guess, I would not be surprised if any or all of the Republican candidates are members of one of those groups, except for Ron Paul, because he's the only one who's saying the right things. You know, he's the one who's trashing the Federal Reserve Bank and system, saying that, we're paying them to print counterfeit money, and that's essentially the truth.
If the Federal Reserve Bank suddenly went away due to pressure from citizenry, that Henry Ford thing about, yes, there will be a revolution before tomorrow morning. If there was enough hell raised about it, what do you imagine it might be replaced with?
Well, the U.S. Treasury Department is perfectly capable of printing American currency, and they would not charge interest because it's straight out of the government. You know, do you realize that our entire personal income tax money goes to pay that debt? Not 1 cent goes to government programs that we'd be expecting from our personal income tax. It's just the personal income tax, okay? During the Reagan administration, he formed the Grace Committee. I don't know if you remember that. The Grace Committee wanted to look into, waste, to see if they could streamline things. So they were looking into where the income tax money was going, and they had a horrifying report to give them after 1 year of study. They said it all goes to the Federal Reserve System to pay the debt.
Well, speaking of debt and speaking of currency and speaking of it being backed with anything, is it your opinion that there's anything in Fort Knox in the way of gold?
Fort Knox has not been audited since 1953. Despite a law saying that it must be audited annually under the Gold Reserve Act of, I'm sorry, that's the wrong date. But anyway, it's supposed to be audited every single year, and hasn't been done for nearly 60 years. The U.S. Treasury Department consistently refuses all demands by lawmakers to audit Fort Knox bullion. Unofficial estimates, however, listed a 52% drop in the amount of gold bullion between 1958 and 68. You know, at the end of World War II, we had 700 million ounces of gold in Fort Knox, which amounted to about 70% of the world's gold supply. This was verified in that last physical audit. Now we go to 1968, and all of a sudden there's a 52% drop. By 1981, the estimates of the gold supply had dropped to 264.1 million ounces, and no one knew where the missing 400-plus million ounces went. Some press reports blame the Rockefellers for manipulating the Federal Reserve into selling U.S. gold at low prices to anonymous European speculators. That might be true. But the source of this story, Louise Auchincloss Boyer, who was a longtime secretary of Nelson Rockefeller, mysteriously fell to her death from her New York apartment 3 days after the story broke, so there must have been something to it.
Understood.
Yeah, so anyway, I'm sorry, it wasn't the Grace Commission, it was the Gold Commission that Reagan formed. And, a year later they came back and shocked the nation by reporting that the U.S. Treasury owned no gold at all. And this is, the early 1980s. And that all the gold formerly in Fort Knox was being held by the privately owned Federal Reserve Bank as collateral against America's national debt. Now, the Federal Reserve Bank does list gold on its balance sheet, claiming to hold it for the U.S. Treasury. But this could mean that the Fed is using the gold supply of the American people as collateral for money it prints and the interest it charges for that service. So,
unbelievable.
Yeah, it is. This institution has been a terrible curse. Let me tell you about how they've manipulated the markets sometime, because everybody thinks that the Great Depression of the 30s was just a happenstance. It really wasn't. It was manipulated. Once the Federal Reserve got into power, they expanded America's money right away. The supply went by 62%, expanded. And a lot of it was used in bidding the stock market up to crazy heights. This led to a spike in loans to the public and to banks. In the stock market, there was a new type of loan called a margin loan. And investors with the margin loan only had to pay 10% of the stock's price to gain full control of the stock, the remaining 90% being loaned by a broker. The margin loans could be called in at any time, however, and had to be paid within 24 hours. So this usually resulted in the investor selling the stock. In 1928, a congressional committee discovered that the Federal Reserve Board was working with executives of European central banks to engineer a major crash. Evidence indicated that this plan was first discussed in 1927. During the summer of 1929, John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, Bernard Baruch, and other banking insiders quietly sold their stock holdings. They literally left the market, put all their assets into cash and gold. After this, the Federal Reserve Board raised the discount rate, and New York financiers started calling in their 24-hour margin loans. Investors had to dump their stock on the market in order to pay for margin loans, and this collapsed the market, creating what we know as Black Thursday and a domino effect of bank failures as depositors demanded their savings. There was no FDIC insurance back then, so people were actually scared that the bank went out of business, they'd lose their life savings. This happened to a lot of people. The Federal Reserve did not come to the aid of the banks despite its legal mandate to maintain an elastic currency. Within 1 year, $40 billion in wealth had been lost from the stock market crash. But the banking oligarchs in Europe made a killing by waiting for the market to bottom out and then buying stocks at a 90% discount. Thus, the billions were not really lost. They were redistributed among the banking oligarchs. Those who have studied the episode are certain that the Great Crash in 1929 was scientifically engineered. Congressman Louis McFadden stated that the crash was a means for European bankers to regain the vast amounts of gold that they had sent to America during World War I to finance the English and French armies. Milton Friedman, Nobel Prize-winning economist, blamed the Federal Reserve for the Depression during a 1996 interview on National Public Radio. So, and also, after the crash, between 1929 and 1933, the Federal Reserve contracted the money supply by 33%. As much as anything, this fueled the Depression. Louis McFadden, who was always a staunch opponent of the Fed and the European bankers, introduced a resolution to file charges against the Federal Reserve Board members. He also introduced a resolution to impeach the Treasury Secretary, his assistants, and the Federal Reserve Board. After doing that, McFadden survived 2 attempts on his life. One was a shooting when he was getting out of a cab in New York, and the other a poisoning at a banquet. His life was saved by a doctor friend who happened to have a stomach pump. He survived those 2 before dying under suspicious circumstances that were reported in the press as the flu. So anyway, that's an example of how the Federal Reserve can roil the markets and create depressions. We're in a Great Recession right now. That's what people are calling it. And there's evidence that this is manipulated, too. It's all about redistribution of wealth on a massive scale. It all began in 1999, this new recession, when Congress repealed the Glass-Steagall Act that allowed banks to issue unlimited credit. Immediately, the media touted these schemes like derivatives and hedgelets, tempting small investors to gamble on mortgages. The initial returns were so sparkling that more investors, corporations, and independent banks and state and local governments began to invest heavily. Then in 2007, the bankers began to issue warnings that these trendy mortgage investments, might be in trouble. And at the same time, they stopped the flow of fiat money, which had inflated the real estate bubble. So the bubble burst in September 2008, and when Congress initially refused to vote for bailout money, the bankers promised an economic meltdown. It was financial terrorism, amidst the stock market crash where the Dow dropped 777 points, which is the biggest single-day drop in stock market history. When Congress still refused to vote for a bailout money, the White House joined in with the Treasury Department and threatened martial law. The Congress finally wrote the bailout bill, as you remember, passed it after having only minutes to see its final version. The Fed solemnly promised that every dime of the $700 billion bailout money would be accounted for. But just 5 weeks later, the Treasury Secretary announced that the bailout money would not be going to the troubled mortgage assets, as the bill intended, but to non-bank financial institutions and consumer finance. This indicates the bill was just a Wall Street coup, a blank check that to date has raised the bailout figure to more than $10 trillion.
And no one has gotten in trouble. No one has been prosecuted. Nobody's been charged. Nothing.
And the Federal Reserve has reneged on its promise to account for anything. It hasn't accounted for almost any of it. Much of the bailout money has gone into buying other banks, not to relieve the mortgage crisis, and this indicates that derivatives were indeed at the center of the crisis, because the banks didn't use the bailout money to issue new loans. They bought various businesses at vastly reduced prices due to the recession they themselves created. So the recession was engineered a lot like the Great Depression to redistribute vast wealth to international bankers and to supply an argument for a single world currency printed by a single world bank, just as J.P. Morgan's manipulated bank panics convinced many of the need for a U.S. central bank back in 1913.
Just jumping around here a little bit, we hear a lot about these connected people having affiliations with Skull and Bones. Would you like to touch on that for a minute?
Oh, sure, yeah. Well, Skull and Bones is a fraternity at Yale University